felony under federal law. The conspiracy, the potential penalty would be the same as if you completed the conspiracy.
So Gracie got caught because someone she worked with was caught, and facing imprisonment, they turned a dime. They rolled, which means to turn in others to the cops in exchange for freedom. With Reagan's harsh mandatory minimums, rolling on your colleagues was one of the only ways to save your own skin.
You know, mandatory minimum sentences, people going away for horrendous amounts of time for cannabis, which no one should go to jail for cannabis, period. And other drugs, too. I mean, it's like almost it's okay to kill somebody, just don't smoke a joint while you're doing it. You had these draconian sentences, which then, because of the only way out of it was to cooperate, it changed the industry. A friend of mine who recently retired, who did this shit for like 40 or 50 years, always had a hat in his office, a little baseball cap that said, "Nobody talks, everybody walks." And there was a lot to that. And, and look, when you got a 21-year-old kid and you're threatening him with 5 years in prison, well, when you're 21 years old, 5 years lasts forever. When you're 40, 5 years ain't that long anymore. So there wasn't that much of a threat. But when you start talking about mandatory 10, of which you're serving 85%, none of this 2-for-1 stuff, you're serving 10-year sentence, you're going to serve 8.5 years. You get 54 days a year off good time, 15%, that's it. So when you're talking about a mandatory 10, a mandatory 20, you had a lot more people cooperating.
And pointing fingers.
Pointing fingers at people, dropping dimes on people, ratting people out. And that's really how the whole war on drugs, the criminal justice system became. It's just get someone, tell them you're going to prison for the rest of your life unless you give me someone else, and people start giving up their wives, their brothers, their daughters, their husbands. It was horrendous.
Gracie and her lawyer worked for a couple years on the case. She poured all her resources, time, energy, money into the debacle. She becomes broke, has to send her child to live with relatives. The feds threaten 8 years. But with the effort she and her lawyer pour into the case, Gracie manages to only be sentenced to 3 years for conspiracy to smuggle pot, sometime in the vague future. So Gracie prepares for prison. She puts her business on hold, says goodbye to her child and family, and reports to serve 3 years. Gracie was allowed to select the first prison she went to, and like any good hippie, she picks the prison with the best vegetables.
It was like looking through a book and picking a college. Has salad bar. Somebody wrote a little book about all of them. It was your guide. My lawyer said, there's no guarantee, but you could pick your first and second choice here, and if there's room, I think they'll try and place you there because they don't really want to give you a hard time.
Tell me about prison. Paint us the picture. What does prison look like? Where are you sleeping? What are you doing day to day? What do you miss?
Drinking water. One of my friends said, "What would you like when you get in there?" And I said, "Would you tape the birds that sing in the morning on the lake so that I've got that sound in the morning when I wake up?" And then I got to my cell, and when you opened the window, there was a marsh. And so right away, I felt like that was a gift from the universe.
Gracie spent most of her 3 years in a medium security prison, but she ended up moving around several times.
So I was moved around to 3 different prisons in a short time, so I really got to see kind of the different kind of institutions America has and a lot about how they're run and what goes on, and it's,
Tell us about it. Is it the worst?
Well, there's also really sweet moments. Waking up after a little LSD trip, because you have to do something to alter your conscience. I mean, you just can't. I just needed some cheering up, so I would take some. And, Sunday morning waking up, or I hadn't been to sleep, but everybody else was waking up. Yeah. And it was like just all these sweet human beings running around and borrowing quarters from each other and checking to see if everyone had enough laundry detergent because it was a day off. And it was just, the women were very kind to each other and very sweet and very supportive. And the rules were different in every prison. In some prisons there was cameras on you and you couldn't touch each other. And that was difficult. Because you could get in serious trouble for giving somebody a hug when their mother died. And in other places, you could get in serious trouble for allowing yourself to get a sunburn, even though they didn't provide hats or sunscreen or sunglasses. And many times you had to work outside. And you know what the infraction was called? Destruction of government property.
Even though Gracie remembers sweet moments, prison is not a slumber party. One prison she lived in went through a crisis situation concerning a plan between the guards and a male prisoner to blow up the women's prison.
At one point, some dude had stolen some jewelry. Anyway, he had a network, and there was a men's prison and a women's prison, and this helicopter was aiming to come into the men's side and escape with somebody. And how they were going to do it was they were going to bomb the women's side, distract everybody, and then land and take the dude out. So they were just going to bomb us. And so all of a sudden, all these feds rushed into the middle of the prison, all armed with their guns drawn and blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, they took away a bunch of the guards. And the guards had sold us. They had, for 6 figures, agreed to put a bomb off on our side. So that was one of the times I thought, oh my gosh.
Wow.
Death for pot, that would be a wild thing.
Gracie overwhelmingly feels her experience in prison was surreal, just totally bizarre.
I got to ride Con Air. You know, we were out there on the tarmac when they moved us from one prison to another at the airport, and they got us chained. We're handcuffed. Our hands are chained to our waist. The chain goes down to our feet, and our ankles are chained. So you can sort of shuffle, and you have to walk up the airplane steps like that. And there's all these dudes standing around with machine guns, and, there you are, and you think, oh gosh, I'm an extra in somebody else's movie.
One of the takeaways Gracie has from prison is the absurdity of who was imprisoned federally. Some of her fellow convicts include a woman who tried to assassinate President Ford. Another prisoner worked in mail delivery and threw away the junk mail because she wanted to go home early as it was 9 degrees outside. Then she was sent to federal prison because throwing away mail, including junk mail, is a federal crime. And there were other smugglers. A woman serving 50 years for pot, plus a crew of parakeet smugglers.
And, there was then the parakeet smugglers. Oh, people that smuggled rare birds. I mean, people that had been busted peeing in Yosemite.
In federal prison?
Yeah, because maybe a kid saw them do it. Most of the people in women's prison are actually victims. And quite a few of them were afraid to go when it was their time to go. Because they just went out, set themselves up for no one was working with these women or helping them figure out why they maybe should stop making terrible choices or, and they'd end up with these abusive boyfriends and.
In prison, everyone is assigned a job. Gracie was in charge of recreation, and she headed up a dedicated meditation group.
And another funny thing about prison is that there's lots of prison literature in prison. So you go to the library and you can read about everybody that was ever in prison.
Gracie was eventually transferred to a penitentiary in the Pacific Northwest, where male prisoners were allowed to hunt and would provide fresh meat for everyone else locked up. Let's just take a moment on that. The male prisoners were given guns to go out and hunt for food.
Up in Washington, we didn't even have to wear uniforms, and there was all these Northwesterners, God knows what they were in prison for. There were dudes in there that had been busted for this or that or the other thing, and they owned these giant ranches that had walk-in freezers to the next ranch. And so they would fill our prison freezer. They couldn't feed themselves unless they fed everybody. So we would have salmon for dinner, and we would have bear for dinner, and we would have elk for dinner, and moose for dinner. It was sort of weird. And we had karaoke night.
Well, that sounds a little bit fun.
And, I had plenty of fun. There was this one prison guard that said, you're having fun. And he said, you're enjoying yourself. And I said, well, why not? Am I going to be miserable? Why waste my time being miserable? I spent a lot of time being outraged at how crazy it all was. But when I got to the halfway house, I remember they made me go to this counselor, and the counselor said, I don't usually get people that aren't bitter. I said, I'm not bitter. I knew I was breaking the law.
After release, Gracie gets sent to a halfway house.
For how long were you there?
They held me for a while, but I work in rock and roll, so I got to go out in the evenings. And there's this another great story about how you're really being held by criminals even though you're not.
Yeah.
So I would come back in, and there was only a dude on at 3 a.m. when I would come home from work. But it was a job. They were required by law to let me go to work, even if it was at the, rock and roll palaces. And I would come in, and I had to agree to a pee test every single time I came in with the male guard watching. And so you know what he did? He tried to sell me his pee for $70. And I said, how do I know your pee is clean? I know mine is. Fuck off. I mean, really.
Yeah.
Just kind of nuts.
Totally.
I know. It was so surreal. I called it Marshmallow World. You look for where something is, and what it is just keeps moving. It's all moving. Life is kind of like that in the end, it turns out. But it was like so extreme there.
Now, today, after spending 3 years in prison and leaving pot smuggling behind, Gracie says what she feels most acutely is relief.
In the years since then, it was cool not to be frightened. At some point while I was in, a sweet Buddhist nun that used to come meditate with us wrote a book about freedom, and she interviewed me, and I said, oh, I'm much freer now. And that made her sort of curious. And I said, well, I'm free of all the little white lies. Because you can't tell people that you're going to go sell a pound of pot. So you tell people you're going to the movies. And so you lie all the time to protect people, so it's well motivated. Yeah. But it's still little lies, and they get heavy after a while. And so it's really, I'm so glad that it's legal, because it's a shame. Lies they're not, they are sort of unclean, and they do have a certain weight. And so it was a sacrifice to be one of those people that insisted on pot being a beneficial thing and, fuck the laws, basically.
So like my parents, Gracie lived a double life, and it eventually became overly burdensome. Neither she nor my parents regret being pot smugglers, because they believed in the product and the cause. However, the mental hardship of working outside the law is real, deeply taxing, and accumulates over time, no matter how honorable you or the product are. And Gracie was fortunate because she was part of a tight-knit community that took care of her and her child, and she had a great legal team, plus returned to her neighborhood as a hero.
I was really lucky. So many of the women went home. I mean, I got to come home a hero. So I'd go dancing, and there'd be a $100 bill in my pocket that I didn't know who would put there. I'd come to work, and there would be $1,000 in a brown paper bag on my desk. And it was like, none of my stuff disappeared other than what it cost me to defend myself and everybody else. And I spent plenty on that. I spent everything on it. I was broke when I finally got there. The reason I stopped fighting was because I was completely out of money. But I didn't lose anything because of my lifestyle, and people just took care of it for me while I was gone, and they did my work for me, and it just, nothing left. But I certainly had to develop a new sense of the worth of $1 when I got out.
So watching their colleagues and friends get busted, go to prison, or flee the country was horrifying for my parents. Along with the sadness of watching their friends' lives be torn apart was the terror that people would turn a dime. My parents could only hope that they would be spared if any of their colleagues rolled, like Gracie's associate. Growing up, because I didn't know my parents were lawbreakers, I never felt unsafe or worried that I would come home from school and find my parents in jail or our bags packed to flee the country. However, this podcast pilgrimage into Pandora's pot box is continuously uncovering surprising disclosures and discoveries. Now let me scrape my jaw off the floor once again and share a recent one. I was talking with my mom, and she casually mentions in the late 80s they could have been busted the same way as Gracie, when a family friend with whom we'd vacationed in Kauai and whose daughter gave me a Culture Club cassette tape for my 10th birthday was busted and rolled on everyone but my dad.
He told on everybody but us.
Really?
All through his